It's a particular pleasure to address an audience interested broadly in architecture, because at the heart of the architectural project lies the concept of space, and in particular our own many-faceted relationship to physical space. And I want to suggest tonight that this same relationship is vital to the concept of prosperity, not just in the obvious sense of facing up to the constraints of human coexistence on a finite planet. In fact, I shall speak very little tonight about the limits themselves. I shall take it as read that anthropological climate change is happening, that high-quality resources are rapidly being depleted, that energy crises and material scarcities are a real threat to the stability and well-being of our economies, if not immediately, then at the very least within the space of the next few decades. It isn't primarily these physical boundaries that concern me today. Rather, I'm interested in space as the relationship between things. And I want to argue that space is a component of prosperity, as important as the physical stuff from which our material lives are inevitably built. Having once upon a time been a mathematician, I should warn you that I shall tend to use space in a 4 or possibly 5-dimensional sense, as certain others have famously done in the past, and suggest that time too has something to tell us about lasting prosperity. And having once been a philosopher, I should warn you that any discussion of prosperity is inevitably a complex one, as old as the hills in many respects, intimately bound up with our understanding of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Athenian philosopher Solon, writing in the 6th century BC, once suggested that we should call no man happy until he is dead, a concept of prosperity almost incomprehensible to the modern view of prosperity as an increasingly frantic rush towards instant gratification. Factor in the dynamics of climate change, the desertification of arable and semi-arid regions, the loss of habitats, the deterioration of soil quality, the collapse in biodiversity, and the idea that relentless increases in material consumption can provide the basis for economic stability, let alone a meaningful prosperity, seems particularly suspect. Which is ironic, because prosperity is supposed to deliver hope. Prosperes in the original Latin is to live in accordance with our hopes and our expectations. But we've cashed out prosperity, almost literally in terms of money. And we've already grown our economies so much, and with so little respect for the fragile ecology of the planet, that we're now in a real danger of undermining hope. Ironically, again, the only thing that slowed down the relentless rise of carbon emissions in the last 3 decades is recession. But that's no recipe for hope either, as we've spent the last few years finding out. And so we find ourselves caught in a kind of trap, between a rock and a hard place, between trashing the planet on the one hand and crashing the economy on the other. And our best effort to escape that trap is a kind of blind faith in our own cleverness, in technology, in doing things more efficiently. Don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking technology. In fact, I'm sure I don't need to draw your attention as architects to some of the wonderful things that technology can already do to improve the energy efficiency of our buildings, for instance. Here's a wonderful invention. These simple, innovative building materials, aerated clay blocks, as it turns out, made famous by the Prince of Wales' own architectural project of a natural house, are a case in point. Technological improvement is not just possible, it's already happening. This innovation is particularly interesting, of course, because, as I'm sure the engineers amongst you have already noticed, it's the space between things rather than the material stuff that's doing all the work for us. Openness in place of impermeability. Holes in the once solid walls of our lives. Revolutionizing our building methods, changing our construction models, creating more room in our local communities, doing unseen work through the clever use of space. A very simple example of the power of space in delivering a more sustainable prosperity. But to be realistic, let's look at the scope, the scale of the challenge that we're facing, the scale of the challenge that technology faces. Imagine for a moment a world in 2050, a fairer world, in which 9 billion people can all aspire to Western income, with an annual 2% salary hike built in. How much technology would we need to meet our carbon targets in such a world? Here on the left of my diagram is the carbon intensity of the economy today, 770 grams of carbon dioxide per dollar of global economic activity. And here on the right is where we would need to be, 6 grams of carbon per dollar. It's a 130-fold reduction in carbon intensity, 10 times further and faster than anything we've achieved in our entire industrial history. And by the end of the century, in fact, we need an economy in which the carbon intensity is less than zero, where economic activity begins to pull carbon out of the atmosphere rather than pumping it relentlessly in. Maybe it's achievable. Who knows? My question, though, is not whether this transformation is technically possible, but whether it's possible in our kind of economic system. And in pursuit of that question, I want to spend a couple of minutes looking at the dynamics of the modern economy. I'll try and paraphrase in human terms as we go along. Firms produce goods for households, for people, and they also provide us with incomes, which is great because we can then spend those incomes on more goods and services. It's called the circular flow of the economy. At one level, this is all pretty harmless. It's just essentially relationships between people doing things, making things for each other, selling them to each other, a set of social relationships. I want to highlight one particular feature of this economy, the fact that people tend not to spend everything they have in one go. Security matters. The future is uncertain. So we put some of our money in banks and pension funds and ask them to invest it for us. Investment constitutes less than a fifth of the income in a modern economy, but it plays an absolutely vital role in economic structure. Much of that investment throughout the course of the last century has been directed towards increasing something called labor productivity, our ability to do more things more efficiently with fewer workers year on year. Productivity growth presents the modern economy with a very specific challenge. Because if you're doing more each year with fewer people, then unless your economy grows, you end up putting people out of work. Unemployment is the flip side of labor productivity. Labor productivity drives us continually towards economic expansion if we want to maintain full employment. I want to return to this question when we begin a search for solutions, but right now, let's acknowledge that productivity growth isn't per se a bad thing. For one thing, it brings prices down, and that makes more things available to more people. It also allows us to play one of our favorite games, the game of the new, the game of novelty. And this is one of the most interesting parts of this dynamic. The economist Joseph Schumpeter, 100 years or so ago, called capitalism a process of creative destruction, continually throwing over the old in favor of the new, seeking out new markets, developing new products. And what makes this particularly fascinating is that it turns out that human beings, you and I, have something of an appetite for novelty. We love new stuff, not just material stuff, of course. We like new experiences, new adventures, new ideas. But materiality is important because material things constitute a kind of language, a language of goods, the late Mary Douglas called it, a language that we use to tell each other stories about how important we are, for instance. Conspicuous, status-driven consumption thrives on novelty. And suddenly, we can see how Solon's careful distinction between story and stuff has been eroded in modern economics. The ability of stuff to constitute a symbolic language allows the modern economy to function, because we will always be interested in each other. We will always be driven by the desire to enhance our own story. All we need is the power of the advertiser to create the symbolic link between stuff and story, and we have a ready-made recipe for economic expansion. As Victor Lebeau described it 60 years ago, our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfactions, our ego satisfactions in consumption. We need things consumed, burned up, worn out, replaced and discarded at an ever-increasing pace. This picture is no longer a static economic diagram. It's a powerful twin dynamic driving consumer society forward. The profit-making entrepreneur is the perfect complement for the novelty-seeking consumer. Economic structure and social logic conspire together to lock us into an engine of consumption-fueled growth, continuously pulling material stuff out of the environment and through the system, driven by novelty-seeking materialists masquerading as human beings. Suddenly we can see that this is a system driven by anxiety. Adam Smith called this anxiety the desire for a life without shame. In his day, it was just a linen shirt that you needed to be seen in public without shame. Nowadays, of course, it's a high-definition TV, a hybrid car, a netbook, 2 holidays a year in the sun, an iPad, bare minimum. And we need this stuff, even if we don't want it, because if we don't buy it, the system crashes.